Hi, friends. How are you doing today? I really hope that you guys are having the day that you deserve. My name's Carly Ramsey, and you are listening to the Serial Zodiac. I'm so excited that you're here and that you're wanting to listen to this episode. So, with that being said, I don't want to lollygag on too long, but I will be here for you guys every other Thursday to push you out new content. So, that being said, let's jump right into today's story. Thanks, guys. Warning: this podcast episode contains explicit language, mature themes, and thought provoking content. Listener discretion is advised, and it's not suitable for minors or the faint of heart. Know what they say: when two people love each other, they're ready to kill for each other. But back in the 80s, a couple took this thing a little too seriously. Not only did they kill, but they indulged themselves in the most sinister pleasures. They carried out their sick fantasies on innocent people and continued to evade arrest for years. But by the time the authorities had finally caught up to them, it was too late. The damage had already been done, with over 30 innocent lives either lost or ruined forever. This is the story of the Ken and Barbie Killers, a dynamic that began with the disturbing relationship between Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. He was born in Scarborough, Ontario on August 27th, 1964. His parents, Kenneth Walker Bernardo and Marilyn Elizabeth Bernardo, had a rocky relationship. It's known that Kenneth would regularly sexually abuse Paul's older sister, Deborah, and ended up facing some serious charges because of it. So it's unclear in the research if Paul was like forced to watch this, but from everything that I was reading when I was researching, it looks like this happened quite often, usually like in the family room. So I don't think it's that he was necessarily forced, but it was just happening so openly that he was there to actually see it. But on the other hand, Marilyn, Paul's mother, struggled with depression and agoraphobia, which led her to isolate herself in the basement. Despite the family drama, Paul tried to keep up appearances. He was even involved in the Boy Scouts, but behind that cheerful facade, things were getting pretty dark. Paul started developing some troubling behaviors, like playing with fire and getting lost in some pretty disturbing fantasies. One of these fantasies, which he told his friends, was it basically, one of the fantasies involved him wanting to create a virgin farm. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, what is a virgin farm? Well, to paraphrase Paul, he basically wanted a barn where he could keep virgin women locked up and use them whenever he wanted, essentially. Like, just, oh, like, let me go pick that one today, and that's the one I want to use. It was quite disturbing. His friends were like, yeah, bro, those are not Those are not normal fantasies. Most people don't fantasize about things like that. So they were kind of side-eyeing Paul a little bit. So in 1981, Paul's world turned upside down. His mom dropped brand new information on him, revealing that Kenneth wasn't actually his dad. It's unclear of how this came up in conversation, if she told him because she was mad at him or if it could just kind of slipped out. But as you can imagine, Paul was pretty upset. He also then took to verbally abusing his mother, calling he started calling her a slut and a whore, and he didn't hold back on her, but she didn't hold back on him either. She one of the things she liked to call him was a bastard from hell. So that that is Paul's that is Paul's family life. I'm not laughing because it's funny. I'm laughing because that's horrible. Um it's a coping mechanism. So Paul's love life didn't fare much better. His first girlfriend dumped him for one of his friends, and Paul didn't take it well. So he got back at her by setting fire to all of her things. Yikes. Paul attended Sir Wilfrid Laurier Collegiate Institute, and then later he attended the University of Toronto Scarborough. And it's wild to think that another infamous murderer, Russell Williams, was just a couple years behind him in school. But as for work, Paul was involved with Amway. If you haven't heard of Amway, I saw it on my TikTok the other day and I kind of just went down the rabbit hole, if you want me to be honest with you. I fully went down the rabbit hole. Apparently, it's like a legal pyramid scheme. Like they basically you get on and then you recruit people under you. It's like your typical pyramid scheme, and like what they don't tell you is there's only like 3 people who are like actually making money in this company. But it's like a legal pyramid scheme, and they get lawsuits against them all the time, apparently, allegedly, I guess. I should probably say that. But apparently it's quite frequent for them to get lawsuits thrown at them, and they end up 99 of the time just settling these cases so that way it just goes away. So that's Amway. But Paul started working at Amway, and that sales culture, it left its mark on him. So Paul and his college friends had a habit of using pickup techniques on women that they met at bars, and they were pretty successful at it. But Paul started taking things to kind of a dark place. He enjoyed humiliating his dates in public and getting very aggressive with them during anal intercourse in bed. His relationships became increasingly volatile, and he threatened to harm his partners if they spoke up about the abuse. Hence why he had trouble in his dating life. Yeah. But in 1986, Paul's behavior landed him with a restraining order from 2 women after he had made some obscene phone calls. All these things were troubling signs of things to come. But even more troubling than these acts was his zodiac sign. Paul Bernardino was born under the sign of Leo. He had always been characterized by traits such as confidence, charisma, and a strong desire for recognition and admiration. Leos are often seen as natural leaders with a need for control and dominance. And in the case of Paul Fernando, I think I've been pronouncing his name wrong this whole time, but that's okay. In the case of Paul Bernardo, his Leo traits may have manifested in his manipulative behavior and his desire to assert power and control over others. His charismatic facade likely played a role in his ability to charm and manipulate those around him, allowing him to maintain a facade of normalcy while engaging in horrific acts of violence. The tide of Paul's life shifted forever in 1987 when he was 23 years old and he crossed paths with 17-year-old Karla. So, Karla was born in Ontario back in 1970 to Dorothy and Carol Homolka. I'm so bad at pronouncing names, guys. I apologize in advance. But we'll get into her zodiac sign in just a few minutes. But she was the oldest of three siblings. She was described as this well-adjusted, pretty, smart, and popular kid. She even had a thing for animals, which led her to work at a veterinarian clinic after high school. But sometimes things aren't as they seem. So, before they became the infamous Ken and Barbie Killers, Paul Bernardo and Karla were drawn to each other. Their attraction only got stronger when Bernardo found out that Karla was into the same twisted stuff as him. They developed a very strange dynamic in their relationship where Paul was the abusive master and Karla was the willing slave submitting to whatever he wanted. But you're probably thinking to yourself, how does a 17-year-old meet a 23-year-old that's in college when they lived like an hour away from each other? So, the veterinarian clinic that Karla worked at was attending a conference that was put on by one of their biggest animal food distributors. The veterinarian clinic saw that Karla really liked animals. She was already a technician at the veterinarian. And so they invited her to come along with one other girl. They get to the hotel, they check in, the girls decide that they want to stay in a room and their management, the people that was with them was like, "Yeah, that's fine. Like we're right next door. We'll be there if you need us." Well, later that night, Karla and the other girl who was at the conference with her um ended up going downstairs. They went to the bar. Karla met Paul and they just couldn't keep their hands off each other. It was said that they actually spent the rest of the night in Paul's room and you know, doing what adults do. Um I know this sounds weird. 17, 23. You're probably thinking to yourself, "Wow, that sounds a little illegal." But apparently the age of consent in Canada is 16. So he was good. Karla's parents were aware of it and they were okay with it because, I mean, he at one point was living with them and he was coming to see her every weekend. So they were very aware of it. They were okay with it. So, yeah. But eventually they got engaged. Karla was telling her friends how great things were and how romantic Paul was. But behind the scenes, things weren't all sunshine and rainbows. After about 3 years, Paul started feeling restless. He wasn't satisfied with the fact that Karla wasn't a virgin when they had first met. So he started looking for excitement elsewhere, and he set his eyes on none other than Karla's 15-year-old sister, Tammy. Now, you're probably thinking, Karla would have been furious about this, right? Well, you would be absolutely wrong. She actually encouraged Paul's desires for her sister. She even told him that she wanted him to take her sister's virginity as a Christmas present. So, yeah. Do you think Karla's zodiac sign had anything to do with her behavior? So, Karla was born under the sign of Taurus, and Tauruses are known for steadfastness, practicality, and loyalty. Tauruses are often seen as reliable and stable individuals with a strong sense of loyalty to those who they care about. But in Karla's case, her Taurus traits may have influenced her willingness to go along with Paul's twisted desires and remain loyal to him despite the atrocities he committed. Her practical nature may have been contributed to her ability to compartmentalize her actions and justify them to herself, allowing her to maintain a sense of normalcy in the face of unimaginable horrors. Overall, though, the combination of Paul's Leo traits and Karla's Taurus traits likely created a toxic dynamic in which Paul's need for control and dominance clashed with Karla's loyalty and practicality, and it led to a spiral of violence and depravity that shocked the world. And this this is where a series of the most brutal crimes began. Between 1987 and 1990, Paul was up to some seriously messed up things in and around Scarborough, all of which involved girls from the area who were falling victim to brutal assaults at his hands. But did Karla know? The answer is yes, but that's not all. She also supported him through it. So, the way that Paul would usually commit his crimes was by stalking his victims after they got off buses late at night. To kind of give you an idea of what his MO was, he usually kept his pattern the same. So, when his victims would get off a bus, he would grab them from behind, he would pull her from to the ground, and then he would force anal and fellatio on her, and he would talk to the victim the entire time before he would let them go. So this happened a few times between 1987 and 1990. And Paul was really like watching these victims, which, side note, I don't understand where he found the time to do this at, because he would watch and basically stalk each victim, and then he would like attack them. So just to like get into the attacks, on May 4th, he had attacked a 21-year-old woman right in front of her parents' house after following her home, and he just assaulted her right there. 10 days later, on May 14th, 1987, there was another rape incident, and this time it was a 19-year-old woman in her parents' backyard. And after this came an almost 2-month long break. I don't know, I guess he just was like, gotta stop raping. So he took 2 months off. Um, and he continued his rampage back in July 17th of 1987. And then that was when he tried to rape a young woman, but she had fought him back, so he just kind of gave up. Then September 29th of 1987, Paul had broke into a 15-year-old girl's house, threatened her with a knife, and then he ran off when her mom showed up. December 16th, 1987 was one of the worst cases. So it was involving another 15-year-old girl. who had become his victim. And at this point, the cops had issued a warning to women in Scarborough. I mean, it took them long enough at this point. Just a few days after that, on December 23rd of 1987, Paul had raped a 17-year-old girl. And by this point, he had started to earn himself the nickname of the Scarborough Rapist. On April 18th, 1988, he had raped another 17-year-old girl. And on May 25th, 1988, he had almost gotten caught by a cop, but he managed to slip away. So 5 days later, on May 30th of 1988, he attacked an 18-year-old woman. And after a long break, he came back on October 4th of 1988 and tried to attack someone in Scarborough, but they had fought him, so he just ended up stabbing them. So this has been over the span of 2 years. And by this point, his sexual assault had climbed to 11. And so after he had taken that little hiatus, he started back raping people in 1988. So it went on like this until 1990. And he continued to target more women, break into their houses, threaten them with knives, and he did the most unthinkable things to them. One of the things that Paul liked to do, he liked to basically just find anything he essentially could. Like, when I say anything, anything that was like literally accessible to him: sticks, knives, his fingers, his body, and proceed to, you get where I'm going with this. So, this went on for quite a while. And so, as you can pretty much imagine, these women were terrified because there's this man who's taking you, assaulting you, beating you up. Like, in a lot of cases, like sometimes he would just be just cruel. One of the cases, he ended up literally stomping on, I believe it was either her arm or her leg, and he broke it. He would literally physically beat them up. So like some of them would have black eyes. Like, he was brutal. The police were striking out. Even though they had collected from women a lot of physical evidence that would help determine if they had the right suspect, they had also had what was considered to be a good composite drawing of, we now know Paul, drawing of the man who was assaulting these women. The police had decided for some reason to only share that drawing with other policemen in the region. And for a reason that's very controversial now, they decided not to show it to the public for a really long time. And I mean, we can see why that caused controversy. So eventually, in July of 1990, the cops had gotten some tips about Paul, and they started actually closing in on him. So at this point, you would think, okay, this is where the story ends. He's going to get caught, right? You'd be wrong. He literally is just getting started at this point. So just go ahead and get ready to be disappointed. Between May and September of 1990, the Toronto police were on a massive hunt for the Scarborough rapist. They tested DNA samples from over 130 suspects, trying to find out the guy who had been on this disturbing spree against the women in Scarborough. Then they got two tips that pointed straight to Paul. The first one came in June from a bank employee, and the second one came from Tina Samarinas, the wife of one of Bernardino's friends, Bernardo. She revealed to the cops how Bernardo had been called in for questioning before, but never interviewed. Apparently, Paul had a habit of opening up
to them about his sex life, even mentioning that he was into some of the rough stuff. So, after that call, the police had finally sat down with Paul on November 20th of 1990 for about 35 minutes. And surprisingly, he willingly gave them DNA samples for testing. When they asked him why he thought he was on their radar, he actually just straight up admitted that he looked like the composite sketch that they had. Um, and I mean, at this point, you gotta give it to him. Even after doing all of that, he had so much confidence. And because of this confidence, the detectives found him more believable than the people that had reported him. So somehow he had managed to manipulate the entire scene in his favor, which just showed how smart Paul was when it came to evading arrest. I mean, he literally sat down, had a whole conversation with them, admitted that he looked exactly like the composite sketch that they had. And one of the biggest reasons why they really didn't suspect him was because they were like, well, if this is the guy, then if this is the guy, why would he just willingly give us his DNA? And you would think that the DNA would be like, oh, drop, nail, bucket, done. No, because you got to remember that this happened in the 90s and it happened in Canada. In the 90s in Canada, DNA was just being introduced. So they had all this DNA, but the process to get DNA ran because it was so new, it took such a long time, which we're going to get more into that. But this all would eventually lead to the first murder that the couple committed. Around 1990, Paul's life had become a total mess. He had lost his accounting job and started smuggling cigarettes across the US Canada border. But get this, even with all that, he was hanging out a lot with Karla's family, who had no clue about his shady side. Soon, things started to get really dark. So, despite being engaged to Karla, Paul had become really, really obsessed with her younger sister Tammy. He would creep up to her window and sneak into her room while she slept to pleasure himself while watching her. And guess what? Karla actually helped him out by she would break the blinds so that way it would be easier for him to like peep. She would break the window so he could easily get into her sister's room. Karla not being a good sister. Karla not a girl's girl. So it escalated, obviously, and things started to get worse. So, according to Paul, in his own words at trial, Karla had spiked spaghetti sauce with crushed Valium that she had stole from her job at the animal clinic. And she served this to her sister, who immediately passed out. That's when Paul assaulted Tammy. Right there, while Karla was watching. After a minute, Tammy had regained consciousness, but this wouldn't be the last time that Paul did this. So he he didn't rape her at this point. He just sexually assaulted her. But I guess Tammy I mean not Tammy. I guess Karla got the dosage wrong on the Valium, and so Tammy ended up waking up in the middle of this, and I believe it was said that she kind of felt like something was off, but also in a lot of the research that I was doing, it kind of alluded that like Tammy knew Paul was flirting with her and she knew her sister knew, but she kind of liked the attention, but that doesn't excuse anything that Paul has done. So, I mean, like, obviously, Tammy is underage. She just liked the idea of an older guy seeking attention from her. So, 6 months before their wedding, Karla had swiped an anesthetic called halothane from the clinic. And on December 23rd of 1990, and mind you, this is like around Christmas time. So Karla and Paul drugged Tammy with the sleeping pills in a rum and eggnog mix. So when Tammy passes out, they undress her, and with Karla putting a halothane soaked cloth over her face, they filmed themselves raping her in the basement while Tammy's parents were sleeping upstairs. Now, at this point, you could really argue that Carla's Carla's just going along with this because I mean, honestly, at this point, she's in the house with her parents. Like, her parents are literally sleeping upstairs. Her other sister upstairs. She could have gotten help, but she chose not to. She was very, very, very willing to be doing all of these things. She could have easily gotten help. This could have been the end of this story. She could have kicked him out, been like, "No, this is not happening. You're not doing this to my sister." But instead, they go on filming themselves while they're raping her in the basement. And this is around the time that Tammy starts vomiting. And
Tammy starts to vomit, and Paul and Karla honestly just absolutely panic. They try waking her up, but it doesn't work. So, what they decided they were going to do is they hid the evidence, the videotape, and the drugs and the towel, and they end up dressing Tammy. And then, after that's all done, then they call 911. But by this point, Tammy had already choked on her own vomit, and she was declared dead at the hospital, and she had never woken up. Now, here is the extremely messed up part. Even though there were some really sketchy things that were happening, like Karla was vacuuming and she also started doing laundry when the police came, and it was like the middle of the night. And so the police are like, this is weird. And then not only that, but Tammy had a chemical burn on her face. And Paul and Karla just were kind of like, "Oh yeah, like the chemical burn must be from like when she threw up." And they just kind of explained it away, and the police believed them. And then also the police just kind of attributed like her being weird and like washing clothes and vacuuming to her, like that was like her way of grieving. The police kind of just assumed that. They were like, "Oh, she just lost her sister. She's probably going through a hard time. Like maybe this is just her way of like coping." And because I mean, everybody grieves differently. So they just thought it was her way of coping. But unfortunately, it was her covering up evidence. But even with the chemical burn on Tammy's face, the coroner and Carla's family just bought the story that Karla and Paul spun to them. They said Tammy's death was an accident. She just choked on vomit after drinking too much. And the family grieved and believed the story. And the police went ahead and marked the case of Tammy dying as a natural cause. I mean, a natural cause at 15 is crazy, but that's what they did. So after Tammy ended up dying, Paul and Karla filmed themselves having sex like the same night. They filmed themselves having sex, and because Paul wasn't able to finish with Tammy, he I'm not sure if it was his idea or Carla's, but somehow Karla ends up wearing Tammy's clothes and pretending to be Tammy so that way they can finish filming themselves. They Then after this, they like leave Carla's family's house and they end up moving into a rental, and it was under the guise of like they wanted to let their family grieve, and Paul really wanted his own space. So that's just like the era that they were in. They were being sketch and no one was catching on to it. So you would think that this accidental death would kind of teach them a lesson because they truly weren't intending to kill Tammy. They were planning on drugging her and raping and assaulting her, and that was supposed to be it. But because the dosage was gotten wrong, Tammy ended up choking on her own vomit and dying. You would think this would teach them a lesson. Like their crimes so far have been raping and assaulting and beating, but this is really their first time actually. This accidental murder was actually their first time unaliving someone. And so naturally you would think like, okay, they're going to stop, like this has taught them a lesson. But it didn't teach them a lesson at all. They didn't learn anything from this besides now they're kind of like, "Oh, like I'm a little untouchable." Yeah. In the early hours of June 15th, 1991, Paul was driving through Burlington to get some license plates. That's when he had crossed paths with 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey, who had been locked out of her house after curfew. So Leslie was in a very, very rebellious stage of her life, and she was just not missing curfew. There were just things that she was doing, and her mother was kind of trying to rein her back in. And the neighborhood was relatively safe. It was a relatively safe neighborhood. And so she missed curfew. Her mother was like, I've had enough. I'm done. Like, I have to, like, there has to be some type of punishment. The punishment was to lock the door. So her mom locks the door. She comes home. She can't get in. She goes and tries to call one of her other friends and tries to spend the night with them. They say, no, sorry, you can't. So she just goes and decides, well, someone's going to open the door eventually. They have to. So I'm just going to hang out here on the porch around the house so that way I can get in whenever they open the door. Well, unfortunately for her, Paul would at some point approach her and he would tell her that he was trying to break into her neighbor's house, which she was kind of like, okay, like dude, whatever, it is what it is, like it's not my house, I could care less. So she basically was like, whatever, I don't care, do you have any cigarettes? And whenever she asked him this is when things would really take a terrifying turn. So Paul would end up blindfolding Leslie and he ended up shoving her into his car. So after he blindfolded her and shoved her into his car, he ended up driving her to, this is like, it's a Canadian city name and I'm really not sure of the exact name. So I apologize if I'm pronouncing it wrong, but I believe it's Port Dalhousie, I think. And this is where he would tell Karla that they had a victim. So Karla and Paul, they, for some reason, which, anyway, they both decided to videotape themselves torturing and assaulting Leslie together. It was said that there was pop music playing in the background, and in the middle of them assaulting and torturing her, Paul actually told Leslie that she was doing a good job. It was kind of like it was a sick game for him. So he ended up threatening her, saying that the next 2 hours would decide her fate. These videotapes, from my understanding, are very, very graphic. I believe that they are out there. I know that during the trial, the general public was not allowed to view these tapes because there were minors on some of them. But the jury was able to view these tapes, and the general public got the audio only of the tapes. And I'm going to be honest with you, I did not go and search the internet for these tapes. I do believe that they are out there, but I don't want to listen to them. I don't want to see them. I just have no desire to do that. But if that is something that you want to do and go scour the internet for, I am 99.9% sure that they are out there somewhere on the internet. But it's just not something that I had the desire to do. So these videotapes, like I stated before, were played in court during the trial. And at one point while they were watching these tapes, things started to get really, really bad in the tapes. Leslie could actually be heard begging Paul to stop because it was so painful. But he just continued to assault her while her hands were tied up with twine. So Leslie actually managed to hint that she might be able to identify them if she had survived. And I'm assuming like this alarmed and upset both Paul and Karla. And so the next day she was dead. Paul actually claimed that Karla gave her a fatal dose of I think she gave her Halican, while Karla said that Paul ended up strangling her. But either way, poor Leslie died. It was pretty horrific. After a family dinner at the Bernardo's house, so at Paul and Karla's house, they actually decided to chop up Leslie's body and encase the pieces of her body in cement. So Paul even went out and actually bought the cement himself. And this would leave behind evidence that would later come back to bite him in court. So the couple ended up using his grandpa's saw to cut up Leslie's body. And then they ended up dumping the cement blocks in Lake Gibson, that is not too far from Port Dallas. But the problem with this is that Lake Gibson, when I was doing my research, I was seeing a lot of like the police weren't thinking that it was local people that was doing this, because any of the locals knew that that lake dropped by several feet during the summer. I guess because of like how hot it is, and it's just kind of it drains during the summer essentially. And so any local would have known that anything that you're burying there, it would come to the surface because of how low the lake's levels drop. But I guess I don't know if Karla and Paul weren't aware of this or if they just simply didn't care. But that's where they ended up actually dumping these cement blocks with her body in them. And one of the blocks actually weighed as much as 200 pounds. So they were way too heavy to actually sink properly. And the way that they ended up being found, they actually ended up washing up on shore on June 29th of 1991, which ironically enough was Paul and Karla's wedding day. Leslie was actually able to be identified thanks to her orthodontic appliance. So many years later, in 2005, just before Karla's release from prison, Paul revealed some really chilling details to the cops and to his lawyers. So he actually claimed that he always meant to let the girls they kidnapped go. But while Leslie was actually blindfolded, Karla panicked. So she was worried that Leslie would ID Paul and turn them in. So Paul and Karla planned to kill Leslie by injecting an air bubble into her bloodstream, causing an air embolism. But what if I told you that that wasn't the end of it? So, yeah, they managed to evade arrest for a very long time after this particular incident. So, in the meantime, they would continue to indulge themselves in whatever they wanted. And obviously, at this point, they've racked up two bodies. Paul has um, raped and sexually assaulted upwards of 11 to 13 women. And so, obviously, them doing whatever they wanted was going to lead to another murder. On April 16th of 1992, during the after school time, Paul and Karla were driving through St. Catherine's looking for victims. It was pretty quiet, and even though the students were heading home. So, this is when they actually spotted 15-year-old Christian French walking back from the Holy Cross Secondary School. They had pulled her into the parking lot of Grace Lutheran Church, and Karla got out of the car with a map, pretending to need directions. And Kristen leaned in to help, and that is when Paul struck from behind. He held a knife and he forced her into the front seat, while Karla restrained her from the back seat by yanking her hair. So when Christian didn't make it home, her parents knew something was seriously wrong and called the cops. So, unlike the death of Leslie, when they were just like, oh, she's a rebellious teenager, oh, she just ran away, um, this Kristen disappearing was there was much more urgency behind it because they knew that this was out of the ordinary for her. And honestly, unfortunately, in Leslie's case, no one thought that she was missing, so no one was looking for her. They were looking, but they weren't looking in a sense of, oh, we have to find her urgently. There might be something wrong with her. They were kind of passively looking for Leslie. They were more so like, oh, well, eventually she'll turn up. Like teenagers run away all the time. And so that's something very unfortunate for Leslie. But luckily for Kristen, her parents knew immediately whenever she didn't come home that something was wrong. So with them being able to spring into action like that, within a day, the Niagara Regional Police Service was scouring Kristen's route and gathering evidence who saw the whole kidnapping go down. They even actually ended up finding Kristen's shoe in the parking lot, confirming the abduction. It was Easter weekend, and the couple had gotten their hands on Kristen. And the entire time, they filmed themselves torturing and raping her, and she was also forced to drink a lot of alcohol. During the trial, the prosecutor actually mentioned that Paul had planned to kill Kristen all along because she had never had a blindfold on and could identify them. So the next day, Paul and Karla ended up murdering Kristen before going to Karla's family's house for their Easter dinner. Karla said Paul strangled Kristen for 7 whole minutes, but then Paul claimed that Karla beat her with a rubber mallet because she tried to run. So then Paul strangled her with a noose tied to a hope chest while Karla fixed her hair. They they were just sick. Like it they don't really they don't make sense. So Kristen's body was discovered on April 30th of 1992 in a ditch in Burlington. It was honestly just a short drive from where they had abducted her from, and it was really close to actually where they had buried Leslie. So she had been cleaned up and her hair was chopped off. Some people thought that it was kind of taken as a trophy, but later on, Karla testified that it was cut to make her harder to identify. So now these were the three murders that everyone was absolutely sure Karla and Paul committed together. But countless others have actually remained unconfirmed to this day. The next set of murders that I'm gonna talk about, they're not actually officially linked to Karla and Paul, but a lot of people actually speculate that they had something to do with it. So Karla and Paul actually were not trialed for these murders, but they were a lot of people speculate that they may have committed these. So 22-year-old Elizabeth Bain, she had vanished back in 1990, and she was checking out the tennis schedule at UTSC, and 3 days later her car was found with a big blood stain in the back. And Paul was actually seen around the Colonial Danforth Park area where Elizabeth was actually last spotted. And he later admitted to attacking girls in and around that park. So meanwhile, Elizabeth's boyfriend, Robert Balsavich, was convicted for her murder, actually. His lawyers kept saying that Paul did it, but Robert's conviction was actually overturned in 2004, and he was retried in 2008. And the Crown said that he was innocent. And when asked about Elizabeth's case, Paul played it cool, saying that it wasn't him. But if we think back to how Paul has acted this far, he also was very calm, cool, and collected when giving the police his DNA, and openly admitting to them that, yeah, like, I look a lot like I really look a lot like the composite sketch. That's weird. That's wild. So I think the lesson here is that Paul can't be trusted. He can't be trusted. He's a master manipulator. That's the lesson. Paul can't be trusted. So after he said that that wasn't him, not that we should take any of that at face value, there was actually another case right after Tammy's, which is, if you don't remember, Tammy is Karla's sister that they murdered. So right after her funeral, her parents took off, and her sister Lori went to go visit her grandparents, leaving the house empty. And according to Stephen Williams, during one weekend in January of 1991, Paul kidnapped a girl and took her into the empty house where she was assaulted by the couple. After that, she was left on an empty road near Lake Gibson. The They called her January Girl. Then there was another crazy incident on April 6th, 1991, where Paul had actually kidnapped a 14-year-old girl who was training for a rowing team. She had actually gotten lured by this blonde lady who waved her from a car. And before she knew it, Paul had dragged her into some bushes near the rowing club. He assaulted her, and he had left her there for 5 minutes, after which he just vanished. In July 28th, 1991, Paul started stalking Sydney Kernish, who was 21 at the time. He had first noticed her while driving home from work, and then on August 9th, he continued to follow her. This time, though, Sydney caught wind of it and decided to head to her boyfriend's place just before he showed up. And when her boyfriend actually spotted Paul, he went after him. He spotted Paul's gold Nissan and noted down the license plate, and they reported the whole thing to the Regional Police, or the NRP, who figured out that the car belonged to Paul. An officer even actually swung by Paul's house and saw the car parked there, but didn't take any further action or file a police report. Do you understand how frustrating it is that the police could have caught this man before any of these murders went down? That is the most frustrating part of this case. They had his DNA. They had the composite sketch. They had the complaints against him stalking women. They had proof that it was him. They had the license plate to his car, and they simply didn't do anything. They dropped the ball on this one 100%. So on March 29th of 1992, Bernardo started stalking and videotaping sisters Shannon and Carrie Patrick from his car, trailing them to their parents' house. The sisters actually managed to jot down his license plate, and Shanna reported the incidents to the NRP on March 31st of 1992. The cops gave her an incident number just in case more information turned up. Again, hit Paul Paul's license plate was given to them. On April 18th, 1992, while French was still being held captive, Carrie spotted Paul when he was out grabbing dinner and renting a movie. And even though they couldn't track him home, Carrie actually got a better description of his license plate and car, which she reported to the NRP. And unfortunately, the police didn't handle this information properly. So in 2006, Paul actually ended up revealing that he had been involved in at least 10 more incidents dating back to March of 1986. One guy, Anthony Hainmayer, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. Anthony Hainmayer got wrongfully convicted of one of these assaults and served his full sentence. Guys, do you know how frustrating that is? They had all the information. This man literally went to jail for something that he didn't do, and Paul literally was like, "Yeah, by the way, that was me." Frustrating. So, but on June 25th of 2008, the Court of Appeal for Ontario tossed out the conviction and they actually ended up clearing Anthony's name. So, that's a win for them. Of course, the Ken and Barbie Killers, Paul and Karla, weren't going to evade arrest for long. Eventually, it did happen, but it took a long time. Paul and Karla actually had been questioned by the police several times in connection with different cases, like the Scarborough rapist investigation and the death of Homolka, and Paul's stalking of other women before the French abduction. Then on May 12th of 1992, Paul had a quick talk with some cops from the NRP. And even though he admitted to being questioned before about the Scarborough rapist incident, the cops actually kind of just brushed it off, and they kind of just seen him as like an unlikely suspect. But then 3 days later, they informed the Green Ribbon Task Force to look into the murders of Mahaffey and French. And here's where it gets wild. So Paul and Homolka, so Paul and Karla, applied to change their names legally to Teely. I think that's how you pronounce it, which Paul actually got from some serial killer in this movie called Criminal Law from back in 88. And by the end of May, one of Paul's friends, John Moltile, thought that he might actually be connected to these murders. Then came December 1992, and the Center of Forensic Sciences finally started testing DNA samples. If you remember, way earlier, in basically the very beginning of this, I said that Paul talked to the police. He admitted that he looked like the composite sketch and he gave them DNA, and they brushed it off because they were like, well, he was so casual about it. He was so nice. He couldn't have been a suspect. Way back in 1990, 2 years before this, yeah, that's the DNA that they're just getting around to testing. So they tested his DNA 2 years later. And then on December 27th, Paul did something messed up. I saw the pictures. For lack of better words, and to really paint the picture for you, he beat Karla's ass, like to a pulp. Girl had 2 black eyes. It looked like she was purple and blue. She looked horrible. He beat the hell out of her. And he did it with a flashlight. So it left her with, like I said, a lot of bruises. And Karla actually tried to play it off as a car accident. And when she went back to work on January 4th of 1993, her coworkers weren't really buying it. They actually ended up calling her parents, who came in the next day, and they literally like dragged her out of Paul's house. So she gets back, and sh- she went back in to look for something, and it wasn't until her parents took her to the hospital that she finally revealed that all along she had actually been being abused by Paul. So the cops arrest him, but he gets out on bail. And then one of his friends found a suicide note that Paul left behind. And that is when Karla decided to bounce and stay with her relatives in Brampton. So now this is when things start heating up. It took 26 months, but finally, Toronto police took found out that Paul's DNA matched the Scarborough rapist. So, in the grand scheme of things, all of these things could have been avoided. Literally every murder could have been avoided had they gotten that DNA in sooner. But in their defense, during that time, during the 1980s, 1990s, DNA was really just starting to become this relevant thing. Especially in Canada, it was very slow process for them. They were just starting to kind of like, oh, like we can use DNA to connect some of these people. So in the police's defense, it was a newer thing, but it still shouldn't have taken 2 years to run this man's DNA. So after they found out that his DNA matched to the Scarborough rapist, they put Paul under 24-hour surveillance. And when they actually questioned Karla about it on February 9th of 1993, she shifted the focus to how Paul was treating her. But later that night, she actually revealed everything to her aunt and uncle, admitting that they were both involved in the rapes and murders of Mahaffey and French, and that they even videotaped it all. So the cops reopened the investigation into Tammy Homolka's death, Karla's sister. And Homolk's lawyer, George Walker, tried to cut a deal with the Crown prosecutor for legal immunity, but it didn't fly. Then on February 17th, the detectives had finally gotten enough to arrest Paul on quite a few charges, and they got a search warrant for his place. This search warrant was pivotal because at this point, they were in there specifically looking for those videotapes, because those videotapes would be the end and the beginning of both Paul and Karla. Except Karla had already gotten to the police, and Karla painted herself in a way that it was very minimalizing to this case. She painted herself like a battered woman, a battered spouse. So she was like, "Oh, Paul made me do it. I didn't have a choice. Whenever he was doing all these atrocious things, I was just sitting in the corner shivering, scared for my life. If I didn't do it, Paul was going to beat the hell out of me again, and I was just so scared and I just couldn't. I just So that was Karla. So the police get the search warrant. They're in this house searching because the link to the murders was really shaky, and they had to stick to the stuff listed on the warrant. So this search actually went on for 71 days. And they ended up only actually finding one of the tapes, which was a quick clip of Karla with Jane Doe. But here's the thing, during a call from jail, Paul had tipped off his lawyer about where the rape tapes were hidden. So this whole time, the police spends 71 days in their house, ripping up carpet to see if there are blood samples, ripping out pipes in the wall, ripping up things in the basement because that's where they held some of the girls at. And they find one tape. That's it. They find one tape. And it's not even a tape that they can it's something that they can use, but it's not showing any of it's not showing any of the things that Karla said would be shown on these tapes. Like I said, she was giving them half truths, but she was also smart enough to realize that she needed to paint herself in a way to where she wouldn't seem as guilty. She was there, but she had to do it because Paul made her. She was scared out of her mind. And this is what Karla is portraying and giving to the police. And honestly, if you ask me, it's some real top tier acting. Girl should have been on Broadway, but she chose to do this instead. So, as they're going through this investigation, the 71 days, they end up actually bringing in Karla into the house, being like, "Can you tell us where anything happened?" So Karla, she did a really good job of kind of playing this role. She actually, whenever she showed up to the house, Karla never dressed like this. She was wearing a schoolgirl outfit, I guess, to show how innocent that she was. But she was in the house and she'd be like, "Yeah, that's where we raped her and murdered her." And then she would kind of just be like, "Do you guys know where my perfumes are?" Or she would be in showing them something and then she would go, "Do you know where this book is? My sister really wanted to borrow this book." And it was just like these bits of these little bits and glimpses of who she really was that they were kind of able to see. She even was telling a story at one point about one of the crimes that they committed. And she's telling the story about what was happening and what Paul was doing. And she gets really upset over the fact that Paul drugged this poor girl using their nice champagne glasses. She didn't care about the victim. She cared because he used the nice champagne glasses, and those were the glasses that were only supposed to be used for special occasions, which, in Paul's defense, maybe it was a special occasion to be killing people since they did it so often, but hey, who am I? Anyway, Paul tells his lawyer about the tapes. Paul's lawyer goes in, reaches his arm up in the ceiling. Well, backtrack a little bit. Paul's lawyer reads a note that he got from Paul, giving him the exact instructions on where to go to get these tapes. Paul's lawyer then goes into the restroom, I believe, and he unscrews one of the lights. Mind you, police spent 71 days in here, and this man goes straight to it. He unscrews the light fixture, and he then proceeds to stick his hand all the way up in the ceiling. According to the information that I looked at, his head and his body were basically parallel to the wall, to the ceiling at this point, and he's feeling around and then he stops. And one by one, he starts pulling out these tapes one by one. So Paul's lawyer has the tapes. They watch the tapes and they realize that Karla is not the innocent person that she says she is. Oh, no, no, no. Karla was an active participant in most, if not all, of these videotapes. And if you're thinking to yourself, even the one with her sister, even the one with her sister. So his lawyer finds the tapes, but Paul's lawyer, he was new. But still don't really understand what possessed him to do this. His lawyer thought it would be an excellent idea to hold on to these tapes. So he held on to these tapes and he kept them. He kept these tapes hidden from the prosecution. He yeah, he kept them hidden from the for I believe about 13 months. The police did not know that anyone had found these tapes. They were under the impression that the tapes were actually the tapes were actually just gone. Maybe like Paul had eventually destroyed them, but side note, murderers, serial killers especially, they love to hold on to trophies. So his ego, personally, I feel like his ego would have never let him destroy them because that was his trophy. That was his thing. Like he wanted to remember those forever. Cause I mean, if we look back, even after Tammy had accidentally died, with that being their first murder, he still didn't want to get rid of those tapes. He still wanted to keep that tape so that way he could rewatch it and get pleasure from her dying all over again and the atrocious acts that he committed. He liked this. So his lawyer holds the tapes for 13 months because he's just like, I'm going to look so good in court whenever I go in there and I destroy the prosecution's whole case. Because the prosecution's case heavily, heavily, heavily relied on Karla. Their whole entire case was built on her because they didn't find these tapes. So they were taking her at face value. They even ended up bringing in like psychologists to say that Karla had battered spouse syndrome. So on May 5th, Walker got the word that the government was offering Karla a deal. Karla would only receive 12 years in jail if she accepted within a week. If she didn't, they'd give her a lot of murder charges also. So she ended up taking the deal. The deal was actually she received 5 years for Leslie's death, and she received 5 years for Christian's death. And then because she had admitted that her sister's death was not of natural causes and it was actually a murder, she received 2 years for Tammy's death. So that was kind of how Karla's sentence was broke up. 5 years for one, 5 years for the other, and 2 years for her sister. This deal created a lot of uproar in Canada. So much so that I believe, like, to this day, that this case, like, is actually banned. It's, like, just kind of not talked about. Um, and the Canadian people were kind of like, the government made a deal with the devil. They were very, very upset because they were involved up until this point. And then all of a sudden, Karla gets this deal. Nobody's talking about it. They know that she got a deal, but because there was basically a gag order on the case, nobody knew the type of deal that she got. So they knew she had a deal, but they didn't know what type of deal that she had gotten. And it turns out that she ended up getting only 12 years. So this made the public very, very, very upset. So Karla ends up obviously taking the deal, and on May 14th, everything was finalized, and Karla started giving the cops all the juicy details, including Paul bragging about raping 30 women, which was double what the cops thought. So Karla's just spilling the tea now, making herself look like an angel and painting Paul as the devil. And that was not the case, according to those tapes that Paul's lawyer had. Now, after Karla revealed that they had made tapes, Paul tried to flip the script, saying that it was all an accident and blaming Karla. But on September 1st of 1995, the verdict came down hard. He was convicted on a bunch of charges, including 2 first-degree murders and 2 aggravated sexual assaults. They threw the book at him with a life sentence, no parole, for at least 25 years. Plus, They tagged him as a dangerous offender, sealing his fate. Now, Karla, her deal caused a stir amongst Canadians. So, Paul's first lawyer, Ken Murray, like I told you guys before, he sat on those tapes. I think I said 13 months. It was actually 17 months. And had the prosecutor seen these tapes, they would have never cut Karla this deal because, like I said, these tapes painted Karla in a much different light than what she was telling the prosecutors happened. She downplayed and minimized her role so much. And then you see these tapes, and put it this way, at one point, they realize that Karla actually went out and got one of these victims and essentially like presented it to Paul and was like, "Hey, like I got us another one." Like she was just as horrible, if not like worse than him. But she got off easy because she chose to spill the beans before he chose to tell what really happened. So with him behind with Paul behind bars, he wasn't exactly making any friends. So they had to keep him in solitary at Kingston Penitentiary because people weren't too keen on having him around. He caught a punch in the face from another inmate in 96, and in 99 a whole gang tried to storm his cell. In 2006, Paul actually came clean about assaulting at least 10 other women before his known spree. And some of these attacks happened as early as 86 and even before he started his Scarborough rapist gig. Authorities suspected him of other crimes, like a few rape incidents in Amherst, New York, and the drowning of Terry Anderson in St. Catharines, but he's never copped up to it. Now, fast forward to November of 2015, Paul self published a violent 631-page ebook called A Mad World Order. It's on Amazon if you want to go read it. So then in 2018, October of 2018, Paul was set to face trial for having a weapon in jail, but the prosecution actually ended up dropping the charges because they figured that they couldn't nail him. Now, come February of 2018, Bernardo was eligible for parole, but on October 17th of 2018, the Parole Board of Canada shut him down for both day and full parole. Now, his next shot at parole happened in June of 2022, but it was a no-go after just an hour of deliberation. So, as of May of 2023, after spending a decade at Millhaven Institution, they actually shipped Paul off to La Cameza Institution in Quebec. And it's a medium security prison, and that's where he is serving out his time currently. But to this day, Paul remains in prison. And on the other hand, Karla was released in July of 2005 after serving her sentence. So that's the story of the Ken and Barbie Killers, guys. Also, all of the research that I was doing, because I was trying to figure out, like, why do they call them the Ken and Barbie Killers? It was apparently because of their good looks. And allegedly, it wasn't even the Canadians that came up with this name. It was actually Americans when they saw them. They're like, oh my gosh, they're so good looking. They're like Ken and Barbie, America. But anyway, guys, do you think that Karla should have gotten a longer sentence? Do you agree with the deal that she ended up getting even they after she after she was known to have played such a big role? And do you think they should have taken away her deal after they found out how big of a role she actually ended up playing? I just feel like those are some questions that maybe you guys have. Feel free to talk about it in the comment section, but Thank you so much for watching, and I will definitely see you guys on our next episode. Side note, um, if you're wanting to like watch a documentary, ugh, that word always gets me. If you're wanting to watch some of the things that I watched while I was doing my initial research, I believe it's on HBO Prime. It's not HBO Prime, HBO Max. It's the Ken and Barbie Killers. It's either on Max or Prime. I can't remember which one, but it's like a 4-part series and they go really, really in depthly into the case. And I got a lot of really good information from there. And if you want to go watch that, I would highly suggest it. But like I said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.